Hello, folks. Hope you all are well. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we are continuing onward, marching forward. There is lots of pending work for me to grade. There's lots of things that you all are doing. We will, move forward collectively the best we can, and hopefully, everybody will be satisfied. I will get to it. I'll get your grading done at some point. If you have questions, lingering questions about these assignments, please don't hesitate to ask. I do have office hours. They're posted. Not a whole lot of people have taken advantage of them, but I recommend them. And then also at the same time, you can email me, set up special meetings at alternative time slots, or handle whatever concerns you have via email. I do get a lot of emails, and so sometimes things get lost in the mix. If you don't hear back from me within 24 hours during the week, go ahead and send me another email and remind me. Okay, a couple developments going on right now. Some of you may be paying attention to the, I don't even know what you call it anymore, the sort of never-ending election story. You may have heard that Joe Biden is the winner of this presidential election that we just had. That is not really in dispute by anybody with any sense of credibility or ethics or moral values, which is to say, the counts are still being concluded, but the counting was done, and Joe Biden has won a sufficient number of states to become the next president. And the current president's unhappy by that, and he has been pushing a variety of different theories, as well as, and this is where we come in, legal cases or legal arguments to try to overturn certain types of results. And what you will see if you pay close attention to those cases is the following. A fairly hyperbolic claim, fraud, thousands of ballots, what have you, fake votes or dead people voting, right? But when they get actually into a court of law where you have to provide evidence to sustain your claims, right? You have a claim and you must have a warrant and you must have some data to sustain that. And when you get to the court of law, what happens is they can't produce any evidence. And so hopefully what you recognize from that short little synopsis or summary is that what we're seeing is not a serious legal challenge to the presidential election, but rather a sort of kabuki theater, a sort of carnival, with the president being the carnival barker and a variety of different things happening, that sort of spectacle. That's not to say that these things aren't dangerous. I think they are dangerous. I think they're bad for democracy and they're bad for the country. But in terms of a legal perspective, the president has forwarded, I believe it is 11, it might be up to 12 lawsuits, and he has lost every single one of them because at the end of the day, when you're standing in front of a court of law, if you do not have evidence to sustain your case will be dismissed. And in fact, it was so bad in Nevada that the president's own attorneys rescinded the case. They pulled the case back and said, yeah, we don't want to do that anymore, because obviously they don't have any real evidence. So that's kind of what's going on from the legal side. The other big major issue that I would love to talk with you about, although I don't know how many of you are paying that much attention to it, is the Supreme Court just heard, they just heard oral arguments about a lawsuit brought against the Affordable Care Act. Several Republican governors are still suing the federal government, attempting to get the Affordable Care Act overturned and rendered unconstitutional. And the argument is fairly convoluted, and I think based on what I saw, the assessments I saw on NPR and CNN, I think it's likely that the Affordable Care Act will survive. But basically the issue is this: the Affordable Care Act says if you don't buy health insurance, then you have to pay a penalty, a tax, okay? And that's constitutional because that was the previous lawsuit. They took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, it's a tax, it's fine. And then in 2018, I think it was, the Republican Congress reduced that penalty or that tax down to $0. So if you don't get health care, health insurance, you're required to get health insurance, but there's no actual dollar penalty. And so now the case is, well, if there's no penalty, then the law is invalidated because Congress intended there to be a penalty, right? Sort of convoluted logic. At any rate, there's a variety of different legal questions, but the one I wanted to mention to you, because I think it's interesting and worth thinking about, is this notion of severability. And I think I might have discussed severability before once or twice. I don't remember exactly. But severability is the idea that if you have a law and part of it is ruled to violate the Constitution in some capacity, can you just sever that part out and leave the rest? Okay, and so there's a variety of court cases about that issue, and there are circumstances in which you can imagine that it wouldn't, something wouldn't be severable, like the whole law would fall. It seems like no matter how one feels about the constitutional question, that it seems like the majority of the Supreme Court agrees that this portion could be severed out of the law, and it wouldn't, in the rest of the law, it could continue. So that's this very short synopsis of what's going on with the Affordable Care Act. Okay. Oh, I had a slide. I didn't even remember. I had a slide here. See, this is where my brain is. My brain on elections. I tell you what. I'm teaching political rhetoric next semester, I think. Hey, Flag, you could take that class. It's really my core political communication is really what it's actually, the class. That's what they call it every other university. I don't know why it's called that here. Anyway, the point is that, basically my brain has been in this election nonstop because it's basically, I don't study elections, but I study political communication, and elections are moments of massive amounts of political communication. So here's a sort of, synopsis. I actually wrote this on the 6th, and it's 5 days later before I can actually record the thing. Okay, so it's actually changed a little bit. The election is decided. It is not essentially. It is decided in favor of Biden. That was decided on Saturday. Trump campaign has launched lawsuits in at least 4 states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Nevada. I think there might be a 5th state, but I honestly don't remember. He's basically, his entire legal strategy is to try to eliminate votes that came in for Joe Biden. And so he's making sort of arguments about illegal voting primarily in urban areas, which means he's really making arguments that black people shouldn't vote. Detroit is one of the targets. Philadelphia is a target. Las Vegas is a target. Right? Atlanta is a target. So it's kind of they don't really say it that way. It's just like one way to interpret that is like, well, dude, like if your theory of what's legal and is legal, not legal is true, then really what you're trying to do is you're trying to disenfranchise thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of African Americans, and that's not really that good. Kind of bad. Put it on the bad side. Every single lawsuit's been thrown out. One of the quotes from I saw online was from I think it was from legal scholar, not a media person, but from a legal scholar, was they all seem to have no merit. Right? And then the Guardian said the purpose is to actually sow discord and distrust and not to win, which is to say it's not a legal strategy what Trump's doing, it's a messaging strategy. They're trying to sow discord, and they're trying to fire up their base. And you say, why would you do that? Why would you fire up your base and all that? Well, there's 2 reasons. Number one, the Senate hasn't been decided. There are 2 Senate seats still up for grabs in the state of Georgia. And so, the Republicans want to keep the Georgia Republicans super active and animated so that they turn out on January 5th to vote. And the other is, this is like the one that most people don't know about, haven't read about, but it's basically just grift. The president doesn't have a lot of money, and his campaign doesn't have enough money to pay its debts. And so basically by making these arguments, this messaging strategy about the illegal election, things like that, what he's doing, and if you get the emails, you've seen them, some of you might get them, I don't know, I get the emails, but they go straight to junk. But all the emails that he sends out are basically fundraising emails. So it's continuing to raise funds for his campaign, which is now over. But, most of that money is going to either go to pay his debt from the campaign, pay down that debt, and some of that money is going to go to a new political action committee that he's founding, right, which he'll pay himself with. So it's grift, and that just sucks. Okay. We're actually talking about Brown versus Board of Education today. And Brown versus Board of Education is one of the, it's a crucial case in American legal history. And it's a crucial case for us for a reason that we have not yet really zeroed in on. And I wanted to mention this because it is listed on the syllabus, but I don't know if I talked about it last time. Basically, last time we were with Plessy versus Ferguson, we were talking about sort of overturning precedent. Brown versus Board of Education goes much beyond that. It does overturn precedent, it overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, but it also overturns the entire status quo. And so, because it's about education, it's about the integration of education. But once you say, separate but equal educational facilities are inherently unequal and discriminatory against African Americans, then you have established a legal doctrine that is going to spread much farther beyond just education. It's going to collapse the entirety of separate but equal, right? So it's a decision that has monumental consequences for American political, civil, and cultural life. And ultimately we should focus on it for that reason. One of the things here I wanted to mention at the start as well is that segregation was a legal strategy. Okay, it was a legal strategy that was started in southern states that were upset with the end of slavery at the end of the Civil War. And so basically, as you might imagine, this happens again and again, but when groups lose power, they respond to that loss of power by seeking to recuperate at least a portion or degree of that power in an alternative capacity. Okay, and so the end of slavery is no different. White Southerners realized that they no longer had absolute power over black people. I mean, they weren't even citizens during the, I was going to say black citizens, but they weren't citizens before, they were freed, and so they were considered animals, less than humans, and sort of freeing the slaves. It didn't just get them out of bondage, but it established them as humans, human persons, legally recognized human persons, as well as established them as citizens. And so the South just began this movement really in 1865, right at the end of the war. They began this movement and it started with what we call black codes, which is to say codes by which black individuals were forced to live, where they could live, where they could work, how they could do just daily things, right? Any task that the legislature could come up with that could regulate, they would regulate, okay? And that followed, black codes were followed with Jim Crow laws, okay? And so Jim Crow laws were segregation laws. They were laws that restricted the political and social possibilities of black Americans. And so when segregation, when this started, it started in legislatures, and then when it was challenged in courts of law, the courts upheld this doctrine of separate but equal. And it spread across all of the South, and for our purposes, what we're focusing on today, it included schools, okay? And so I'll give you a couple pictures and examples. On the right, we have a white school, and you can see it has, it's manicured, the yard is manicured, it has, it's mowed, it has a fence, there's a gate. It looks like a pretty up and up building. It's 2 stories. You can see there are blinds in the windows. The windows are all look intact. It looks kind of like that colonial style. I don't know. On the left, you have a school for black folks, and so here you have less of an organized yard. It looks like the grass hasn't been cut. The fence is not chain link. It looks like posts with maybe some wire. It's a 1-story. It's not elegant in any capacity. Some of the windows have blinds, some don't. You can't really tell how good quality the windows are. And then you go inside, and so on the right you see the white school. On the left you see the black school, right? I mean, these have folding chairs versus an actual theater. Has 2 stories. You have better lighting. You have a better stage. You have seats that are bolted to the ground. And again, you move to the right. On the right-hand side, you have I don't even know, like a sitting room or something. Home economics, I think, is what the caption was. And the left, you have bare basic wooden chairs, and there's a sewing machine there. And so basically, separate but equal. It was never equal. It was just separate. Okay, but that was the law of the land for the South. And so given that desegregation of schools was a major goal for the civil rights movement, and now we think of the civil rights movement as the 1950s into the 60s. We think of Martin Luther King. But the civil rights movement had a long history, 50-year history, if not longer. And so a lot of what we say civil rights movement, we're really not giving full credit to the full depth of the movement. And very early on, even the 1890s, the civil rights movement at that time recognized that they needed to improve black education. And in fact, right after the Civil War, during and after the Civil War, the civil rights movement that was mainly located in the North and was run by white folks, white women as had a dominant emphasis or a strength there, sort of power there. They came down to the South to educate blacks, to teach them to read and write. It was one of the first aspects or components of what we might call the civil rights movement in the post-war era was education. Say you can't be a citizen if you can't read and write because you can't understand things. You can't read. You can't understand the laws and the things around you. By the 1930s, lawyers for the NAACP had already begun legal challenges to separate but equal. And there were a number of challenges in a number of states. And those challenges, those lawsuits eventually got combined into a single lawsuit, which we now know as Brown versus Board of Education. There were also student protests, black student protests. They protested in segregated schools. They were simply driven by what we just saw in the pictures. Black schools had less of everything. They just had less of everything. Less quality, less materials, less everything. And so it clearly wasn't equal, and there were student protests as well that were ongoing in the 1930s and beyond. Whoa, what happened? Huh, okay, well, whatever. I already gave you the facts of the case. The facts of the case were that things were separate and not equal. Legal principles. Okay, the legal principles in this case are fairly straightforward. It was a 14th Amendment challenge. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that was passed after the Civil War that guarantees equal protection to everyone in the country under the law, which is to say, no law can provide unequal access or unequal services. If you provide a service to one group, racial, gender group, you have to provide the same exact equal service to the other. Okay. There had been other lawsuits that had challenged separate but equal, and those had always been decided in favor of separate but equal, and they have relied on the decision we used last module, Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay. And so the government, in the suit, in this case, the government's primary argument was that separate facilities are equal in quality. The government didn't challenge. They didn't challenge whether or not separate but equal was constitutionally legitimate on its own. Instead, they challenged the idea that these facilities weren't equal. Does that make sense? Right. One is this sort of notion that guides all or almost all of post-Civil War, legislation, which is okay. Blacks can be citizens, but we can't mix the races. Right. That's a doctrine. Right. The government doesn't challenge that. It doesn't defend that doctrine. It doesn't say that doctrine is constitutionally fair. It instead narrows it down to a very, very small question, which is to say, can separate schools provide equal quality in education? And of course they said, yes, absolutely, no question. Now, it was a hard case for them to make. The Delaware Supreme Court had already ruled that facilities weren't equal, had already demanded integration. Okay, by the time this case got to the Supreme Court, that's one reason why they got to the Supreme Court. They didn't like that, and so the plaintiffs, the parties who were suing, their argument was, look, facilities can never be made equal. Now I ask the question, why does that matter? Well, it matters, and this is the thing I would put to you. We'd have this conversation, but I'll give you the thing. It matters because it's not the government's answer to this lawsuit is, look, these two things are the same. Right? They have chairs, we have chairs. They have tables, we have tables. They have books, we have books, right? And that's not the lawsuit that's being litigated. The lawsuit that's being litigated by the other side is you can never make facilities equal. They cannot be. You could buy the same materials and you would not have the same quality and access to education between the two races. And I'll get to the argument a little bit lower. But it matters because if that's the case, then there is a clear 14th Amendment question, and especially important for this case is that education is a state issue. It's not a federal issue, right? Education in California is different than Texas, is different than Virginia, is different than Maine, is different than Montana, because states determine how their kids get educated, how the kids in those states get educated, not the federal government. In fact, we talk about the Department of Education and it has a huge impact. Okay, the Department of Education does a variety of different things in this country, but in terms of funding schools, my memory says, at least it used to be, less than 2% of all money for schools came from the federal government. And so in this case, the lawyers have to make the argument that there is a constitutional question because that's the only thing that gets the federal government involved. So when the lawyers for the government say, look, there's equal equality, what they're also saying is this is not a constitutional question, therefore the Supreme Court should not be involved at all. And the lawyers on the other side say, no. Separate can never be equal. And that is something we have to talk about because that's the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that's the grounds of the debate, of the dispute. In the actual decision, and most of what I'm giving you in these slides, these couple slides here, is the actual decision. And so it's important to understand the argument, but the real thing I wanted you to focus on here is this. You remember we talked about originalism, original interpretations earlier in the semester? They walk through that in the decision. They say, look, you can't rely on the original interpretation of what the people who wrote the 14th Amendment after the Civil War because it's not enumerated. It doesn't list. It doesn't say, oh, the 14th Amendment applies to the following 10 things. It's not an enumerated list. It just equality, right? Everybody has to be equal before the law. And beyond that, you can't look at their original interpretation because obviously the South didn't want the 14th Amendment because they knew that that would provide more rights, access, education, economic opportunity, etc., to Black Americans. And so if you go back to original interpretation, whose interpretation of the 14th Amendment do you look at? Was their argument, as it's laid out in this case. There is no one you can really look at. And so they termed it inconclusive because there was a debate going on in 1865 when they were formulating this amendment to the Constitution. The other reasons why it's inconclusive they list, and this is super important, is that public schools basically didn't exist in the South in 1865. Whites learned in private schools. It could be a Christian school or whatever, non-denominational, who knows. But there basically were no public schools in the 1860s in the South. And Black schools and Black education didn't exist at all. And so what you have is a situation in which that the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, has to apply to everyone, but you can't think about what the people who wrote that were thinking about at the time because this is a new situation. It's not new, but it's a situation in which all of a sudden there's public schools. There are public schools. And also at the time, some of the southern states banned Black education entirely after the Civil War. And even in the North, where there was a public curriculum, it was extremely rudimentary and was not compulsory. You did not have to go to school. It was optional. And most schools only offered 3 months of instruction a year. So given the sort of radical, dramatic change in education itself, the court says, look, you can't think about what they were thinking about in 1865. Instead, you have to think about how this amendment applies to 1954. There were 6 cases involved, prior cases that invoked separate but equal in education. 4 cases identified inequalities but deferred to Plessy versus Ferguson. That's a typo. And this is described in the decision. But in the decision, they said, again, siding with the plaintiff, you can't look at the quality of the facilities. You have to look at public education as a whole. And the key is to consider public education in the 1950s. What does it look like and how is it working, etc. They also argued that contemporary education was the most important of government services that exists in the country. And that's why this case was landmark and crucial and important, is because you can't do anything, in the 1950s, but even now, you can't do anything in life without at least a high school education in that time. And now you pretty much need, advanced, more schooling, a 2-year or a 4-year degree. And so given that importance of education and the radical shifts in education that had occurred from 1865 to 1954, the court reasoned that it was a case they had to take and that they had to evaluate based on where we are now. Now, all of that exists because they're overturning precedent, right? The precedent is separate can be equal, and they're going to overturn that. And so you can see the massive amount of work that the court has to do, the argument they have to make, or series of arguments they have to make to justify overturning a prior decision. That's how powerful precedent is for the court, or at least used to be. Maybe it still is. The key question then before the court, the way they explain it in the decision is, does separate but equal deprive minority children of equal educational opportunities? And their answer is yes. And it's actually not about the quality of facilities, but rather that separate but equal is inherently unequal. Inherently unequal because it generates feelings of inferiority, it affects hearts and minds, and undermines motivation to learn. And given that, separate but equal treats blacks as second-class citizens and that hurts their ability to learn, to achieve, and to succeed, it undermines the equality of opportunity schools have to integrate. That's it. That's the argument, right? And they don't offer much more than that. It's actually relatively straightforward. It's not complex. It's not complicated. And in my mind, it's an obvious no-brainer. Of course, it does all of those things. Okay, aftermath. As you can imagine, the aftermath of this thing was not the best. Not the best. The southern states were like, oh, hell no, we're not doing that. We're not integrating. Of course they said that. Well, you can't just say no to a Supreme Court decision. But you can try to slow it. And so in different states, I put a couple states as examples. In different states, they did different things. Texas adopted a bunch of legal obstacles to try to prevent, integration. Arkansas actually called out I put National Guard, but I think it was the state National Guard, the Arkansas State Guard or something, to block black students from going to schools. Mississippi didn't integrate at all. There were no lawsuits for 9 years because everybody feared that there would be violence. And guess what? After 9 years of no integration, there was a lawsuit, and the person who brought the lawsuit was murdered because Mississippi was always like that. Different now, but in Alabama, and we come to Alabama, and y'all might know this one, y'all might remember this one. The University of Alabama, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, he tried to stop black students from registering, and Dwight D. Eisenhower had to call in the Army, the National Guard, to provide a pathway for Vivian Jones. And she's here on it's my left. I don't know what side you're seeing. She's here on my left, walking into the University of Alabama to go to school. And that's that. And so it took a long time. There are a lot more legal challenges. And one could even argue that today we don't have, equal education. It's not a hard argument to make. We don't have equal educational opportunities for students because we have a funding system for schools that is based on where you live and the property values. And so if the property values where you live is high, then your school is going to have more tax revenue, right? And they're going to have more resources, and they're going to have the students there are going to have more opportunities. And if the property value is low, urban inner city environments, rural areas in Oklahoma or West Virginia, then you're going to have very underfunded schools, and those schools are going to have very few opportunities. And guess what? Not always, but a lot of times, that lines right up on traditional racial divisions and categories in this country. We don't have a separate but equal doctrine anymore, but we still do have forms of segregation, not state sanctioned, but economic system sanctioned segregation that continues to implicate or impact the way that some of our very talented young people are able to learn or not. One more aftermath. I can't believe I'll fuss off the list. Obviously, it's the bigger aftermath here. The bigger aftermath is this. Once Brown versus Board of Education is ruled in favor of Brown, in favor of ending segregation in educational facilities, it has a cataclysmic effect on the legal doctrine that is segregation, which is to say, if you can't segregate schools, you can't segregate anything else, because this decision, Brown, establishes its own precedent. And so you have subsequent legal challenges, and the 14th Amendment becomes a weapon in the civil rights movement, and still is, as we'll talk about later in the semester. Okay, I hope everyone's doing well. Please hit me up if you have questions, comments, concerns, and stay safe. COVID is exploding right now. The entire country, except like Vermont, is red with COVID, and that's very concerning to me, and I hope it's concerning to you. So stay safe out there, please.